arms crossed like you're watching Black Panther. While you block me, I don't have the answers. Tax that bitch, I'ma eat it like Phantom. Hey, pop out, leave damage. Too many hoes, don't know how to manage. Told me she fuck if I bring her to Panama. 3 rounds in and I ran out of stamina. Got more shoes than a dad got booze. If you haven't heard the news, nobody ain't losing. Sipping on Henny on a cruise, can't trade these views. Know you thought I'd stay choosing. Moving, hit it one time, keep moving. Thinking that's your girl, but she bumping my music. Grooving, laying down a track in the groove. Got the bitches at my show saying, body, this a movie. Chefing, I'm Steffin', I'm cooking up curry. I come with 11, I'm betting you worry. My neck is a blizzard and yours is the flurry. I'm airing it out, then I leave in a hurry. I'm raising this shit like Canes. I told you I'm letting it rain. It's funny when you at the top, how many real ones you know gon' remain? Got my toys in the bag like...
How's it going, guys, and welcome back to another build video, this one on my Unbreakable Amara build, which is a build focusing on running the Stone class mod to provide as much action style damage as possible and to abuse that as much as we can. Now, while this is going to be a build video, this is much more of just an initial showcase to introduce you to the Stone. There are tons of options here. A lot of people within my Discord server over the last couple weeks have been playing around with it, and I've yet to see 2 duplicate builds with even similar playstyles. There is a lot of potential within this class mod, and I do believe it is incredibly underrated for what it is able to provide. I want to give some general information about the Stone while showing off a build to inspire people and to start playing around it some more. And if maybe you need a further little push, I'd like to remind you that the Pestilence does still damage. But with that out of the way, let's get on into things. And I will start off here by giving an overview of the Stone itself. So what the Stone actually does, whenever Amara is damaged, she gains a plus 10% chance to gain a stack of rush. For every stack of rush, Amara gains plus 3% damage reduction. This also increases her max rush stacks to 5, which means at a full build, we can get up to 25 stacks. The Stone is able to roll with Violent Tapestry, Do Harm, and Awakening, with the big focus here for most builds being Do Harm, as at 10 out of 5 in Do Harm, you are getting 9% per stack, though with Awakening that goes up to 11.7% per stack. So at just 25 stacks, that is 292.5 action style damage, and at the max stacks of 99, that is 1,158.3% action style damage. Though that isn't to say Awakening should go unnoticed. The only one of these stills that I think can be completely ignored is Violent Tapestry, as that still just isn't that great outside of like having 1 point into it. But there are definitely builds that can benefit from Awakening more, because Awakening applies to Do Harm, Alacrity, and Violent Tapestry. Having 6 out of 3 in Awakening is the equivalent of having an additional 3 points into Do Harm, Alacrity, or Violent Tapestry, which means say you have them all at 5, you pretty much now have them all at 8 out of 5. So while having more points strictly into Do Harm does provide way higher skill damage potential, having points into Awakening can boost other things as well and can be better for a more general build. But for what we're going for here, ideally you do get 10 out of 5 into Do Harm. And this is really what makes the Stone good. Now the actual passive of the Stone shouldn't really be ignored either, because while damage reduction often is a pretty shit stat, you can get a hell of a lot from the damage reduction. Now damage reduction is calculated very odd in BL3. If you'd like to learn more about it, I will leave a link in the description to a page that has more information about it, but in short, on the card it's listed that the Stone gives you 75% damage reduction. 3% per rush stack, 25 stacks, that should be 75%. In practice though, this does end up giving you closer to around 50%, and trust me, with how damage reduction does work, that makes sense. Now the big problem with damage reduction is that most of the time it stacks very poorly. So if you want to make use of it, you kind of want a lot of it from a single source, and that's what the Stone provides. It gives you one big single source of damage reduction, which can actually be very helpful for dot effects or just basic enemy damage. There is still a lot of sources of damage in the game that will health gate you, but this damage reduction will help out a hell of a lot, especially as it provides you the ability to easily self-dot yourself and to not take as much damage as you otherwise would from it, which is something that I do often use in this build. I'd also just like to clarify a couple things with this. There are some places that say that Awakening does increase the Stone's damage reduction, and this is untrue. I've tested it in every way possible, and it just doesn't work. Interestingly enough, it did introduce a rounding error. I don't know how, because that was the only thing it did. There was no other substantial increase or decrease, but without points in Awakening, it was totally fine. With points in Awakening, it would alternate up and down by 1 point. I'm just chalking that up as the usual shenanigans when it comes to Borderlands and math. But in short, Awakening does not affect the damage reduction. Also worth keeping in mind here, the damage reduction is based off your current rush stacks. As I shoot myself though, you'll see that we do end up building up those rush stacks, and now we're at 25 and we have our max damage reduction. When you cast your action still, those rush stacks get consumed and turned into do harm or violent tapestry. When those rush stacks are consumed, you lose your damage reduction. This is consistent with how this tends to work with things like the Phase Zerker. I just wanted to go over it again here. Now getting more into the actual specific build that I've got going on here. The biggest thing is the Face Puncher, as this is a body and mind focused build to really abuse that skill damage. This is pretty much our main weapon and what I'm running most of the time, and it is what allows me to just flashbang enemies to death with body and mind procs. Now I do use a ×14 to just maximize the amount of body and mind that I get. However, you can use a ×7, but honestly your damage is going to be significantly less and there's not really a point to it. A big reason that ×14 is usually less popular of a Face Puncher is because of reloading it. The Face Puncher has a decently slow reload, and consuming 2 ammo per shot, you're only getting 3 shots out of a magazine before you have to reload. But because we have very good stack upkeep and because I do spec Alacrity, there's more than enough reload speed that when you do reload the Face Puncher, it really doesn't matter. And with those shots that you get, you're pretty much guaranteed to kill at least 1 enemy per shot. So overall, I do just much prefer the ×14. You can also use a Blade Fury, which in this case, I would suggest using a ×4, again, just to get as much body and mind as possible. And while this is perfectly fine and definitely more than usable, I do still just prefer the Face Puncher due to the synergy it specifically has with body and mind, giving far more procs, especially when used with infusion. For these sorts of weapons though, I'm just running ASE melee damage. This is kind of just our only real option for anointments here, as you could use like 150/90 and that would apply to your body and mind, but it would only apply to one of them. So I do tend to just prefer the base melee damage. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I do sometimes self-dot, which does mean that having a low level sellout is incredibly important and very useful. While the sellout does only roll in incendiary and corrosive, because I am using infusion, whatever your attuned element is, you can apply it to yourself through the sellout. This is just an incredibly easy gun to get and an incredibly effective one at applying self-damage. But even more than just dots, this can help you upkeep your rush stacks during mobbing. Especially when you first start out and are just trying to initially build up those stacks, the sellout is an incredibly important tool for this build. And the next 2 guns that I use are a little bit more specific. The Guardian Angel is incredibly good for bossing. I keep one that has face slam damage and one that has orb damage, as the orb is mostly what I use for a lot of bossing, especially things like raid bosses like True Hag and such. But I do carry around the slam one as well, as while it is less effective for a lot of bosses, and using slam effectively does require a little bit more setup, it is really fun to face slam a boss and just one-tap them with it. But that being said, you can actually output some crazy damage. If I did have a +5 do harm roll of a stone, I would have had a clip of me one-tapping Isto with face slam. Instead, unfortunately, I just have this clip of me almost one-tapping him. But yeah, you can actually output some crazy high damage with face slam. And speaking about orb again, I do carry around a Psycho Stabber specifically for when I use orb, just to dump some damage into it. When using this with orb, I would only really recommend hitting it once, as the second hit will probably pop the orb. So if you do need to hit it again, I would unequip the Psycho Stabber and just hit it with your hand. Now there is only one option for our shield here, as this is an action still damage focused build, and there's not many shields that provide more damage to your action stills than the Revolter, as this is a global element, so it just applies to literally every single source of damage that you throw out. This includes your action still damage, ties that bind specifically double dips this damage, orb will also get this while it's active, and all of your body and mind procs will also be getting Revolter damage. This is just an incredibly strong shield in general. However, for this build, it honestly provides even more than it usually does. Instead of using an Ass Break one though, I do just use a very low level one. Now I'm not against using Ass Break here, it can definitely still work perfectly fine, but I do just prefer having that cooldown rate, as the uptime is just far nicer and it helps with upkeeping those rush stacks. There are definitely situations where this is overkill, however I would prefer to have overkill without any downsides than just using Ass Break, because I have tried this build both with Ass Break and with just this very low level one, and the uptime on the damage feels about the same, especially because I do carry around this sellout, so I can also just break the Revolter whenever I want to. Now obviously this build is using a lot of melee damage, so we are just running a Fish Slap here. You could use an It's Piss just to debuff enemies further, but honestly it's just not necessary. The Fish Slap is nice in case your initial damage just doesn't kill a boss. You can throw a Fish Slap and instantly nuke it with Groundbreaker. The anointment here that I run is on Grenade Throw. Weapon, grenade, and action still damage are increased by 25% for 6 seconds. Just an average ASE elemental damage doesn't apply to still damage, but this will. So it is just nice, as again, our focus for everything is on our still damage, and this anointment is what will apply to that. And finally here, our relics. Generally, I just use an elemental stone static charge. This is just most of the time the best and easiest to use for mobbing. However, I have been talking about a lot of self-dotting, and that does make the elemental projector a very good option. If you want to use it for mobbing, I don't have one, but I would suggest just using an elemental projector stone as well, which can be very good for both bossing and mobbing. Currently, I am swapping to this for bossing, as the elemental projector is really the only way that I'm increasing my action stone damage with our relic slot, as there's not really many other relics that can do that. So swapping to this, dotting myself with a sellout, getting the elemental projector damage, and then just slamming or orbing whatever boss is in front of me is usually my playstyle for dealing with bosses. The passives that you're looking for on your relic are AoE damage, elemental damages, and melee damage, though you can roll action stone cooldown rate in these passives, which can also be somewhat helpful. Now there is actually another class mod that we use with this build, and it is the Phaserker. However, we use this more as a utility, because with the Phaserker, when it's equipped, you can fake grasp, which just means you grasp at the ground to make sure that you don't grasp an enemy, and in doing so, it gives you max rush stacks. You can then do it again, and you can stack do harm. As you can see down there, we are now at 99 stacks. So this is especially useful for bossing, as stacking rush can be very difficult in some bossing arenas. If you're going for a speed kill as well, pre-stacking is incredibly important. But once you are stacked, you can just swap back, and now you're getting 99 stacks of that insanely high do harm damage, and that is just how you're going to be melting bosses incredibly quickly. Now for mobbing, this is a phase grasp build, which does kind of bring up the question, is the Phaserker just better if you can more consistently upkeep max rush stacks? And I did actually test this to confirm that the stone is worth using over the Phaserker, because while the Phaserker does have a higher potential to just keep you at 99 rush stacks constantly, even with half of the stacks which the stone is able to upkeep, you will most of the time have around 50 while mobbing, though you can definitely get higher. But even with just those 50, you get way more damage with your action stones than you do with a Zerker. And I tested that with a Zerker on a different build that was actually more set up to make better use of the stats that the Zerker provides. This stone build does average higher damage dealt, even with ties that bind, than your usual ASE spam Phaserker build at max stacks. And just to go over our action stones here quickly, ties that bind is pretty much our most often used for mobbing. I do swap out my elements quite often, just depending on what relic I'm using. Since we do have Clear the Mind, element matching with them isn't a huge deal unless you're bossing, or if you just have specific rolls that are increasing a specific damage type on your relics. So really just match your attuned element to your damage increases, or swap when you're bossing. But for our augments, I use either Stillness of Mind or Expedite. For mobbing, I do tend to prefer Stillness of Mind, as it just feels a little bit more consistent, but I have used both and they're both effective. But when it does come to bossing, I will just unequip Stillness of Mind, whether I'm using Phase Flare or Phase Slam, as Stillness of Mind does just come with a damage penalty and doesn't really provide anything for us for bossing. Now coming over to our trees, we are going to start with our purple tree here, as this is kind of just the most simple and straightforward tree that we have. This is a pretty generic still tree spec for the most part here, just getting some melee damage from No Mistakes in Nature and Joyful Freedom. Combo Breaker can be nice, as it can just give us some better action still uptime. Heavy Rain gives us splash damage, which is mostly what we take it for, as that does interact favorably with body and mind, though the projectile speed can be pretty nice as well. We then just put 1 point into Ebb and Flow, as this is pretty much our only survivability. However, it's more than enough. 5 out of 5 and burn both ends, as this 5 out of 5 and burn both ends, as this is an elemental damage increase. However, it also applies to non-elemental damage, so pretty much this is just a damage increase to literally everything that we do, which is incredibly nice. It also does just synergize well with the stone, as this is a build that focuses on taking aggro and taking damage, so this does also help you keep rush stacks active. Of course, body and mind, the absolute biggest focus of this build, and Clear the Mind, just because we're this deep in the tree anyways, it's a pretty nice skill to have, especially for mobbing. It'll allow you to not have to worry about swapping your element too much. I do also just dump 3 points into Trusting Yourself for a little bit more reload speed and weapon swap speed, which of course are some very important stats here. Again, we are using the ×14 face puncher, so reload speed is incredibly nice, and there is often a lot of weapon swapping, especially for bossing, so both of those are some pretty nice stats to have. These 3 points could be put elsewhere. However, I do just think that with Trusting Yourself, it is the most value that you're going to get out of these points, as everything else is just a little bit less consistent. Onto our blue tree, of course, we max out into Do Harm. Again, I only have a +4, but ideally you do end up with 10 out of 5 into here. 1 point into Violent Tapestry, is not only is this just needed to move down further, but getting that 1 point into Violent Tapestry just helps further with rush generation, as this grants you a rush stack for applying a status effect. Restless for just some cooldown rate, Fast Hands, again weapon swap and reload speed. Ascendant just kind of boosts all of your augments. It's a pretty nice skill to have. If you don't really care about it, you don't need to put this point here, and instead you could put it into Alacrity, which is where I'm dumping a lot of points into, and this may be where the tree starts to look a little weird. Like I said, we do take Alacrity. It does just provide a lot of value, and that reload speed is very nice for the face puncher, but we are not taking Transcend or Laid Bare. The reason is, these just simply don't really provide us anything. Transcend is crit damage, which we can't really crit with most of the things that we do. The action stones we use can't crit, the Face Puncher can't crit. I really don't use the Blade Fury that much, so this just doesn't even matter. But even with the Blade Fury, you're not really using the Blade Fury to crit. So you can put points in here if you are going to opt to use the Blade Fury, but I often don't, and even if I do, I don't really miss it all that much. And Laid Bare, because this is a Ties That Bind build, Ties That Bind doesn't really apply Laid Bare that well, as Laid Bare only applies damage when action stole damage is dealt to an enemy. So really the most value you get out of Laid Bare is you might get slightly faster kills with Phase Flare, but that's really about it. So you could take the points out of Wrath and put them in there, or the points out of Alacrity and put them in there. I just don't really think it's worth it, because you're going to be killing with Phase Flare so fucking fast anyways, it just doesn't really matter, and I prefer the little bit of extra damage from Wrath. Of course, Awakening, this is just going to boost Alacrity and do harm even further. Remnant, obvious choice, broken busted still, gets even more broken with this amount of points into do harm, as this does also deal action stole damage. And Avatar, this is incredibly good as it just gives us more max rush stacks, but this is also what allows us to upkeep that 50 or more do harm stacks during mobbing. So this is also a very important pickup. And our final tree here, the red tree, 5 points into infusion, as this with the Face Puncher is what allows us to double the amount of body and mind procs that we get with it, which is just a stupidly broken interaction as is, but becomes even more so with this build. Now to get this interaction working, you don't really need to put this many points into infusion, but I just do it anyways, as there's not really many other places to put these points. You could do Steady Hands, which is alright, or you could put them all into Anima, but it really doesn't make that much of a difference. I do put this many points into Anima though, because it is helpful with self dots. It makes those damage over time effects that you apply to yourself last longer, which just gives you a little bit more time before you have to reapply them, which can be very nice. Tempest for elemental damage, Illuminated Fist for just some more melee damage, Dread as it just gives us a little bit more damage as well. Worth keeping in mind with this is that this still does actually stack, so using it alongside Avatar does actually let you stack this twice for up to 30% gun damage, which can be pretty nice to have. And these 3 final points kind of can just go anywhere. I just dumped them all into Catharsis so that I could kind of showcase them. I do like having at least 1 point into Catharsis, as this is stole damage. If you do download the save file from my Discord server, these points probably will not be here. If I was going to give a recommendation of where to put these myself, I would probably put some of them into Wildfire, just to kind of upkeep rush stacks a little bit more, but even then it's not really necessary to do so, because you're going to be max rush most of the time when you're mobbing anyways. So I do kind of just like having them here for the fun factor of Catharsis, but they can really go anywhere. With Anima though, it is worth noting that it is entirely inactive and does literally nothing if you have Cryo as your tuned element. This isn't a big deal, it's not worth not using Cryo for, but it is worth keeping in mind that if you plan to only ever use Cryo, Anima is a waste of points. But yeah, that's gonna about do it for this build. Hopefully you guys have learned a little something about perhaps one of the most underused class mods in this game, and I do hope that I've inspired some of you to go ahead and play around with it yourself. If you would like to download the save file for this build, it'll be provided in my Discord server, which I will have a link to down in the description. But that's gonna about do it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, definitely consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, all that. I'll be live right after this video goes up right here on YouTube, and also over on Twitch, where there will be a link to down in the description below. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.